Hello, world, and welcome back to Practicing Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where my friend Lizelle and I will be discussing episode 2 of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series by John Vervaeke. So today we want to begin a little differently and be a little bit more conversational and discuss flow, metaphor, and the Axial Revolution. So I'm going to pass it over to Lizelle to get us started.
Thank you, Sarah. In the Socratic spirit, um, I would like to start by reading a passage from Plato and from Timaeus in particular, where Timaeus himself is speaking. All men, he says, Socrates, who have any degree of right feeling, at the beginning of every enterprise, whether small or great, always call upon God. And we too, who are going to discourse of the nature of the universe, how created or how existing without creation, if we be not altogether out of our wits, must invoke the aid of the gods and the goddesses, and pray that our words may be above all acceptable to them, and in consequence to ourselves. Let this then be our invocation of the gods, to which I add an exhortation of myself, of ourselves, to speak in such manner as will be most intelligible to you and most accord with our own intent, and hopefully also with that of John Vervaeke. But that's not written in Plato. I added that.
Beautiful. Yeah. So that was a prayer from Timaeus. Nice. Beautiful beginning.
May God speak through us.
Yeah. And this is very nice because it leads us right into flow, I think. As last time we were talking about the shamanic experience and how shamans would either through deprivation, sleep deprivation, or not eating or limited diet, sitting in nature, they're experiencing the world in the physical realm and attempting to understand in this embodiment sort of way. And I was telling you before we began about how in astrology there's this idea that the gods work through the planets, and the gods very much want to experience humanity because humans have something that gods don't have, which is mortality. So the fact that we can actually die is what fascinates the gods by us. So, interesting that Plato recognized this desire of the gods to kind of speak through us or to be heard through us, even with that prayer.
Oh, that's inspiration. It's also interesting that you evoke our mortality. I went through. I don't have. I've got the book Flow, but I don't have the hit with me. I lent it to someone, and she's currently experiencing a lot of flow in South America. So, but I do have other books of Csikszentmihalyi, and I was reading through notes that I made and things that are underlined and um, things that I circled and thought beautiful. And he often he passed away since the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis were recorded. He often also mentions like how valuable this our limited time on earth is, and how that even that really just strengthens the importance of spending as much time as possible in flow, because the what we get from flow is this feeling of happiness, enjoyment, but also meaning, like something is meaningful to us. And I yeah I don't know if people necessarily grasp how important, because we talked previously also about the responsibility, which we will come back later when we talk about the actual. But a lot of people spend their time in entertainment, but cheap entertainment, like sitting in front of the TV, which is the least conductive of flow. And the most conductive of flow is things where you actually take up challenges. And so how challenging yourself in life, how important that can be sometimes.
Yeah, John had that diagram that he created where there's a flow channel, and above that is actually so if it's too challenging, of course you'll hit anxiety. And if it's too low in challenge, it would create boredom. And, previously, boredom was actually a state that was where we could be creative because there wasn't things to fill in that boredom. But now that, like you're saying, we have television, we have cheap entertainment, this boredom can actually go, so far into the right, because you could say, or the x axis, it could go too far into that boredom. And then, people are just filling that with cheap entertainment as opposed to something that improves their environment. Because what John says is that through this flow channel, as your skills improve, your environment should also improve. So that induced flow state, if you can get that, you're actually making improvements because the reward is whatever, that feeling is. There's no, there could be an outcome, there could be something that you created, for instance, a woodworker, if they can get into flow state, then they've got a product that they've produced in the end. But that actually, it doesn't seem to be the overall purpose of the flow state. It's just to uh, expand that illumination. I like that aha, 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 aha. And he says it's like, oh, it just like it feels, we know what that feels like to have that epiphany moment or that great idea, that brilliant creation that we want to, bring into the physical realm. And so that elongated aha is the flow state, and being able to remain there is what kind of gives us meaning as far as I could understand from that interpretation.
Yes. Um, yeah, a full life. It gives us, if nothing else, a full life. Um, Life in abundance. Uh, I'm thinking now there's two things probably that keeps people from challenging or from chasing flow states. And the first thing is this fear, because if you start something new, you're either going to be in boredom, practicing scales on a piano, or in anxiety. So, in order to develop that channel where you can experience flow, you're going to have to face those two on purpose. So that could, I can imagine that that keeps people from being willing to chase. And the other thing is that I think that might be um, that doesn't come that through that clearly in John's video is that it doesn't have to be rock climbing. Like you don't have to go to South America to get flow. You can learn to play the piano, for instance, or uh, engage in meaningful conversations more often, or something less challenging and less out there. You can actually cultivate it in here. You don't have to go all out to cultivate flow states. And I think, yeah, maybe that's also like, yeah, I'm not going to take up rock climbing just to get in the flow. You don't have to. You don't have to. So,
Yeah, and on the other end of that would be, as he calls them, flow induction machines, which is video games. And so this the idea of flow state can be kind of also taking place in the virtual world, because in order for there to be flow, there's three different things that he mentions. He says there needs to be tight coupling between the person and the environment, like in a video game. There needs to be very clear information, so that cannot be ambiguous, and that failure has to matter. So these are the three things that one would need in order to kind of search for or produce that flow state. And so it can even come in this virtual world where we were also discussing, and I think it's natural to kind of move into that, not to veer too far away from the discussion, but that idea of how a shaman is different than someone playing a video game, because a shaman is sitting in nature and the failure that they would experience, this failure has to matter, is a lot more detrimental, right? Because they could actually die. A predator could eat them, or they might not have food enough. They might be lacking in water, kidney failure, that kind of thing. So it's actual, the physical body is affected. Whereas somebody that's in a virtual realm, the video games, they're not going to experience true death. It's like death in the video game is not going to cause you to die. Um, so the repercussions of the failure is, you know, much worse in the real realm. And so we were talking a little bit further into how the younger generations are experiencing this, because I said last time that I find my role to be this go between of someone that was raised with the computer. I mean, I grew up with the internet. The internet, is essentially as old as I am, maybe a little older, but I experienced the world before the virtual world existed. We created a world when we came up with the internet. And children now are, Gen Z already experienced this social media um, disruption. It's like this virtual world is telling me I'm not good enough. Other people are better than me. They look better than me, and so that already was a psychological problem. And so I don't mean to say bad or good here, but with the youngest generation that has only ever existed in virtual world being, I can order stuff online and it's delivered to my door in a day. I can, even order food tonight and that's delivered to me by an Uber Eats driver. There is no going out into the world, the physical world, to get resources, to grow your own wheat, to kill your own chicken. There's a complete disconnect between the physical world and the virtual world. And so with children, what does their induced flow state mean now? Where do they find meaning? And it oftentimes is, do they have the ability to step outside of that virtual world, that video game, and say, that's not real anymore? I don't know. But that's kind of the question that this led me to, of shamanic understanding of flow versus this new virtual understanding of flow.
The real, getting in touch with the real instead of the virtual real. What also came up to me, because one of the advantages, of course, of flow is losing self-consciousness,
Yes.
but the virtual world is enhancing that self-consciousness to a great extent. Not the video games, but
Right.
the other, the social media, and so that's really bad.
Yeah, and I guess, just to add, I don't think that social media is an induced flow state, although some people can just sit there and
But that's
mindlessly
like
thumb through.
television, more like comparable, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's that's even another kind of intermediate world. That whole idea of self consciousness, and particularly with Gen Z and millennials too, of self consciousness being so ingrained that you know chaos was kind of created. And so my question, I guess, is it adaptive with the younger generation to be able to I guess virtually flow flow virtually, to practice, to kind of take on certain roles that they don't actually have consequences for, but they can just kind of practice flow state in a virtual world, and then bring that out into the real uh, world, I guess.
Yeah. I imagine it must take quite some skill to be able to transfer the skills in the virtual world to the real world. And I'm not sure that that is a skill that everybody's capable of, especially if you. That's why I love what you say, that you see yourself kind of as someone who can intermediate, because that's actually really important. That could be something that is really needed. Someone that can help people take these skills that they learned in the virtual world and transform it into the real world. Because like the generation you're speaking of now, the young ones who grew up only basically in the, they can't, there's no way they can figure that out for themselves. So There's a niche for you to fill.
Yeah. Well, we were talking too about how culture is like a question here of, is that tradition, is bringing that tradition to those kids or to the younger generation, like they kind of need that connection to the elders. And they're not getting that because we were talking a little about how responsibility is a question. And of course, we're going to get to that in the end because we kind of want to end there. But the responsibility of, you know, taking your own self into account as it applies to the rest of the world. And so that tight coupling between the environment and the young person is going to be completed by their understanding of what the actual physical realm is. What is this environment that I'm in? What is culture? And instead of trying to obliterate it and say that it's all patriarchal in some cases, there's a lot of um, ways in which it's being uh, just demonized culture in itself. And so there's a war kind of that kids seem to be fighting with culture, where it's like, tradition has to be thrown out the door because I am uh, my own thing, and I don't want to be what my parents were. I don't want to be what my grandparents were, all because they can kind of search for information in this virtual realm, and they don't need the elders to tell them anything anymore. But there's so much other information that they can gather just by sitting in the same room with an elder or sitting in the same room of a museum or that kind of thing. There's much more that you're grasping in the physical realm that they just don't seem to have any reverence for.
The image of actually physically rubbing shoulders with someone is coming to my mind. Because if you're in the virtual world, I know there's games where you play with other players, but usually it's all about yourself. Well, if you're
Mm.
out there in the real world, it's very much not only about yourself. It's about the people you rub shoulders with and the people that help you physically survive or that you have to interact with. We talked about how weird it is actually that we live among strangers all the time, but that is also real world situation. That's so I'm wondering if the virtual world doesn't make us more selfish, more less aware of how important other people and the community are, because you have your little box. That's that. What more do I need?
Yeah.
But if you go out and if you embody if the flow state, or where you actually go out and be in the real world, that's there's other people. That's
Yeah, and that kind of emphasizes that point that you were making about self-consciousness, even in that example of I am the one that I'm in control of this entire thing. And so, even if they are getting into the state of flow, it's still centered around one, it's still
yeah.
centered around themselves being in control there. So there's this interesting thing about the shaman like building bridges, and they're doing that by way of metaphor. And basically what John says here is that the brain is getting areas of the brain that don't normally talk to each other to talk to one another. And there can be noise, and there can be enhanced insight and intuition if you can connect actually these parts that aren't, I guess, bullshit. And so our capacity for metaphor is really important in getting the areas of the brain that don't normally communicate with one another to start to talk.
Yeah. I think what is also important is the fact that human beings have that capability of parts of the brain uh, that normally don't talk to each other. Talked. because that's what metaphor is, as that acceptation that
Hmm.
we talked about. Like, we accept things in the real world, like I'm down, and it doesn't mean I'm lying on the ground. It means I'm emotionally feeling a bit yeah, exactly. and, and that is metaphorical. And um so what really, when I was reading this book, the first part is a lot of awesome examples of how we think metaphorically. It's not just speaking, it's thinking metaphorically, which is what makes us homo sapiens, um, is that we think metaphorically to a great extent. And well, yeah, it's how our physical experiences are exapted into our more abstract experiences, or more emotional experience, and more spiritual experiences. And I think, but I might be wrong, that that was fired. I think that's the case that they're making, that ability was fired way back when the shamans became active parts of the community, and that we were fortunate enough through evolution to inherit that abilities. And that is, now we take it completely for granted, how how embodied our conceptions are, how embodied our thinking is, and how the metaphor we use completely influence the way we see certain things.
Yeah, he mentioned that the shaman actually made human civilizations more adaptable. The ones that would have a shaman were actually
Yes.
more adaptable because of that ability to think through metaphor. And I do have some of the examples that he mentions. One of my favorite was supervision, like above and being able to see down. And so oversight, that means someone that's in charge of something. That's metaphorical. Is it hard for you to understand? The hard is
Yeah.
is a metaphor.
And it's
And
also embodied. It's all acceptation of our physical experiences. I think that's really important.
it's so important because we were just talking about with not being in the physical realm, being in the virtual realm. What things are you able to exact from that physical or that virtual realm that the shaman was able to exact from the physical realm? Because that's clear, like it's clear, what, well, I guess it's not clear what they're exacting, but the ability to use that sensory information through this body that evolved versus this thing that we made, the internet, the gaming, world. That's something that we fabricated. And so what actually can you apply from that world that would actually work here? The thing about it is kids are still, for the most part, I think, still using the language of metaphor. And so there has to be some way that it's still getting in there, that they're still able to utilize it, but not knowing the roots of these words, not knowing project, like we mentioned, project, like throwing a projectile, you know.
Okay, but let's be fair. Until John mentioned it, we didn't know it
No,
either. We didn't think
that's,
about it. We didn't think about it that way. But yeah, it is evolution of thousands and thousands of years. So of course, the kids are still going to be able to use that
yeah,
at, for a few generations at least. Still, um, yeah.
but
But
that would potentially go extinct if we don't continue to be aware of it and bring awareness to it.
mm, I really, the more I think about these things, the more I think about how important it is to get back to being human, whatever that means. That's
Yeah, if we want humanity to continue to evolve, because my always I always ask, I mean, this comes through in our programming too, in the movies that we watch and things where people are downloading their consciousness into a computer. And is that how we're trying to seek immortality? Do we want so badly to move consciousness into the future that we're going to download it into something that, needs batteries or some kind of new energy source that isn't organic?
yeah. Uh,
Yeah, cyborgs.
yeah.
So I think, a lot of this conversation is around the Axial Revolution. So that's where he kind of gets to. And we wanted to talk about a lot of the books that you're looking at for this because the moving from the Neolithic period where we got agriculture and humans began to stay in one place.
Well, the New Paleolithic period was where we got our ability to think metaphorically and
Okay.
where we got our symbolism. That was around 40,000 BC. The agriculture was only 10,000 BC when we
Right.
settled
Okay.
and we started to live in communities. The trade was already in the New Paleolithic time, but the settling down, the agriculture was around 10,000 BC.
Okay. See, I wrote 10,000 BC, but I have Neolithic out to the side. So I think I misinterpreted something he was saying. But so around 10,000 BC, we get agriculture, which allows us to settle into civilizations that can just stay in the same place because now they've got food there. They don't have to go out and find food or hunt to that extent. Because, well, what he mentioned was that the shaman was good for, I think he said, oh, let me look, hunting and healthcare, which I really liked because my understanding through all the biology and astrology and philosophy that I've looked into, um, I was for a little while looking through herbalism and how, of course, because now they're staying in one place and they're working with herbs, well, they want to know which ones are poisonous. And so I mentioned Emperor Shenong, who was one of the three original emperors of China, and he would test them himself. So he's actually ingesting these medicines, as the myth goes, and he was poisoned. I don't know. They say a lot. He was poisoned a lot, and so he's starting to recognize correlation here. When I eat this, this happens. And the same is true for hunting with the shaman, where they embody whatever it is that they're hunting. You become, the deer so that you can understand what it's going to do. How do you track it? Well, you have to know where it poops, or where it rubs its antlers or that kind of thing. So you start to embody it by understanding what it will do, something outside of you. And so the Neolithic period, he said, or sorry, 10,000 BC is where we're going to go with the agriculture. Individuals are starting to settle into complex societies. And he says that this, they stay there for significant amounts of time. And, as far as astrology is concerned, this is very important because you can track the movement of the stars now. You're no longer, having trouble seeing where something was the previous night because you're probably using a landmark to say that's south. And there's this star that's moving opposite to the other stars. So they were only able to kind of develop this ability to connect with the stars by staying in one place. And from that, they were able to develop these omens, or these kinds of predictions of, I'm starting to understand my environment. I'm starting to understand where I am a little more. And so I'm extrapolating correlations from things that I see in the sky. When that happens, this happens. And whether or not that's true or not, it could have potentially been adaptive.
I was thinking exactly that. I imagine if you're living in a society, a fixed society, the ability to read omens is kind of a good ability to have, even if it's just for inspiration. Like there's going to be a war, so the gods said we were going to win. So let's go all out. Everybody's all inspired. We're going to win. Odds are you're going to win. Um, the
At least
god
the
said that we
chances are
shouldn't go
higher.
out. Hmm?
I said at least the chances are higher that you will because the morale.
The morale is higher. Yeah, yeah. So I can imagine once we've settled, the need for omens also increased a little bit. That because we're a society that now depends on um, the
Yeah, those
goodwill.
predictive models. And then we move into the Bronze Age. And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because we get glyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, cuneiform for the Sumerians. And so they're starting to log what they see, but in this like symbolic way
Yes, and a difficult way
and
for
difficult.
John's purposes. It's important to point out that it was difficult. So I've got some hieroglyphs here. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh yeah,
I can't read it,
just looks like pictures.
and I think you have to read it up, down, or even like this. I think you have to read it like this. So
Wow.
it's pretty, like what he said, it took years. I was like, oh my god, I want that job. You could have a job as just being able to read. It's like,
Yeah.
why did that change? I wanted that job.
Yeah, because he was talking about scribes and how it was like actually a profession at that time to be literate because it was so complicated.
And then while we're at it, we can compare it to Greek, which is an ancient Greek, which is an alphabetical language, which
Yes.
is very much easier to read. So more people could read Greek or uh, Phoenician or um, Hebrew than the other. But we jumped a bit now
Yeah.
in, and this is Hebrew.
Yeah. And there's like structure to it. There's the alphabet, of course, so that already standardizes it a lot to where it's easier to learn now, and
Yeah.
therefore more people can learn it.
Yes. Yes.
And the reason that this became like another huge adaptation, people being willing to experiment with this, was because there was another event, right? That led us, okay, here we go. Even more so than the collapse of the Roman Empire, he says, was this catastrophic event.
Yes. I like how he compares it to the dinosaurs, the extinction of the dinosaurs,
Yes.
because it was these huge entities that completely dominated these huge cities in the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
And when they died, these little mammals had the opportunity to become human beings, which
Mm-hmm.
is really nice for us.
Yeah.
Um,
Worked out.
Yay, thank you. And these small city states had the opportunity then, or if because this is the book that's about the religions in those, and um, to call it an opportunity is maybe a bit um, looking at it in a very unsympathetic way, because life was not good. It was, she also emphasized, it was through suffering, intense suffering, that the people grasped at these new ways of being, new ways of interacting with the sacred. And I've heard John many times say that people nowadays are like enthusiastic about the possible collapse of our society. And he's like, you don't know what you're asking for. It's not going to be pretty. Like, if we can avoid this in any way, we should avoid this. We shouldn't ask for the opportunity of collapse so that something new can be born.
Oh
So,
yeah. Yeah, you see that a lot. And again, the imagery in like our movies, people kind of get even in their head like, oh, if there wasn't a zombie apocalypse, then I would do this and this and this. And they're all, prepping and all this kind of stuff. And that may be helpful. But, when you run out of the food that you've stored up, what happens then? Are you adaptable in that way where you can go out and provide for yourself? Is it going to be possible if it was a nuclear apocalypse or that
yeah,
kind of thing? Like, it's not as, um, Hollywood as we like to think of it
mm,
as, because we do envisage that we would be that hero that we could overcome. And it's, the necessity is what's going to lead us into that creativity. But do we have to get to that point? Can we metaphorically think about the necessity instead of actually having to experience starvation and famine and nuclear apocalypse?
yeah. We're supposed to be sapiens, right? So why not use some of that wisdom to prevent the need for total collapse in order to build something new?
Yeah, because what we were talking about was with this collapse, you know, we developed second order thinking, and that came through this awareness of our own mind. So when you can actually think, what are you thinking right now? Do you have good
With
memory?
not with the collapse, but with the writing, the
Okay,
the the,
okay,
the easier forms of writing and literacy.
right.
With that we developed the second order thinking.
Okay. So it was this movement from the glyphs, the pictures that were difficult for people to learn. So you had scribes that would be the ones that understood that. But then with this event or this second time that we kind of went through a bottleneck where there's
Yeah. I always forget the date. That's why I'm really glad there's a date. So you can kind of
that helps definitely.
yeah. It also puts it in perspective because if this was when it fell, the great transformation, the axial age, only starts around 800. So there's a
Mm,
few years of darkness before the light returned.
yeah. Yeah, because he was like there was a dark age there. So 1177 to 800 BCE is a lot longer than what people can conceptualize for this. Like, this would be the era of the apocalypse. And that's like a lot of years. I don't know, like 200, 300 years. That's not a lifetime, that's
No,
generations.
and that's when it began, the axial age. It was from 800 to 300, I think. So yeah, so it's not even that everything was solved by 800. There was still a lot of growth.
Yeah. And so we would be hitting the beginning of that if everybody's wishes are true. Like, we would be bringing that in.
We would be in the dark times.
Yep.
We would not experience the next great revolution. We will be in the dark times.
Mm.
It's
Right. So we're talking about how we would be the ones to experience the dark age. So we probably would like to put some brakes on that. And if we can stop this train from running off the edge, we were discussing how that might be possible, hopefully. So I think that's a conversation that we wanted to bring back from, you know, what we were talking about in the beginning of that ancient wisdom not necessarily being so instilled, this tradition not being instilled in the younger generation as much, perhaps. And so we're trying to look for ways that we can assist, I think, or kind of steer, is what we were saying,
cultivate wisdom.
cultivating
Is if we
wisdom.
want to use John's words.
Yeah. Yeah. So how can we cultivate wisdom that will, prevent us from going into the dark ages?
Well, that's a big question.
Right.
But since we're only on episode 2, let's focus on what John talks about in episode 2 and flow. And then we talked about specifically how being in the flow state teaches you the ability to see patterns. And oh, where did I read it? I think it was in Csikszentmihalyi himself today that I read it again. That the ability to see patterns is a form of wisdom. But what both you and me were like worried about a bit is his whole distinction or the way he distinguishes between correlation and causal patterns. Because he does make it sound as if correlation is bad, it's an illusion. Though I am quite sure there are many things that I've heard him say a few times, and then that I know for a fact. This I'm not 100% sure, but I think I've said him say it at least twice that he is not against correlation patterns. It's when you confuse the two that's when the problem gets in because as I've mentioned to you earlier, I'm reading a book on theology for our next conversation, and Paul Tillich actually mentions there that the way to a method of practicing theology is to use correlation, because some causes are just too deep and too big for us to be able to discern those patterns. And as an astrologer, and also as someone who is very prone to seeing patterns, um, correlation patterns more so than causal patterns. Um, well, of course, if we're bullshitting ourselves, we want to know. But I also want to think that there's something real there in what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I was mentioning when we were talking about this earlier about how science can even be construed in a way where you're recognizing correlation, but it's all about how you turn the statistics. You can manipulate the information and the data that you gather in order for your hypothesis to be supported. It's not good practice and you shouldn't, but there are sometimes when even scientists don't know that they're manipulating the information when they're using controlled experiments. It is to adjust the environment to where this will happen. It's to say, when the conditions are set this way, this will happen. Therefore, it is predictive. But that's a correlation that's somewhat being forced. It's because there's never going to be an environment where those controls are in place naturally. So even if you are trying to set the conditions to where the experiment will produce the um, the same results, you're still manipulating the system within which the experiment is taking place, and therefore, you know, it does actually help us to move science forward. But even in science, you're recognizing a correlation that has more to it. There are more things to be measured, and so there are ways that we can still, subscribe to bullshit when we're thinking scientifically and when we're even trying to prove someone else wrong. Because that's what science is. It is actually intended to be checking the work of someone else, not trying to affirm it. You're supposed to actually be putting checks on someone to say, well, when I repeated this experiment, I didn't control for this, and now this different thing happens. And what does that mean? So, like training the intuition involves having that check on yourself, even. And you were talking about how, even in these conversations, right? Where I was saying, like, when I journal, it isn't it is because I am light. I am light. We all are. We are photons, right? And there was that double slit experiment. Here again, it's controls, and I'm kind of falling into the mythology of this experiment, right? Because
The
this double
mythology of
slit experiment is about the observed photon and how it, when it is measured, it could show up as a particle or it could show up as a wave, but the measurement itself is the observation. So I said that it counts. Literally, there's a metaphor, it counts. It means something. It has more meaning in this way when it's observed. So in that same way, we're able to correct ourselves. For instance, with me and my ever evolving relationship with my grandpa, where he annoys me and he gets on my nerves and all these bad things about him. But I check myself because, okay, now I'm putting that out into the world. So now I need to recognize my role in all of this and how I'm actually seeing my shadow reflected in him, and all those things that I don't like about him are actually me. And so I'm putting a check on myself to say it's not all him. It's not all my environment that's causing this. I have some role in, how we relate.
And then you mean you see that mostly through the art of writing, literacy, the psychotechnology, the second order that we were talking. Yes, I like that. How that helps us also uh, test our patterns and our ability to see patterns. Because as I've mentioned to you earlier, because this is also now out there, like during the 2 weeks that we didn't meet, I learned information that I was like, I was wrong. And in the past, maybe I would not have. So even this is second order uh, um, thinking, right? That's a word that he because I'm now more aware of what I have said, and then when I see something that contradicts it, which I did during these 2 weeks, so I apologize.
We're human.
um, I'm I'm learning so much faster, extremely confronted by my own ignorance. Luckily, I'm exceptionally well suited to playing the fool, so that's cool. Um, but yeah, the second order thinking, I also find it interesting because I remember last time I mentioned that no, it's not a psychotechnology this that we now have, but it's such an important thing because we were dishing the virtual world a little bit earlier somehow, but also this is so rewarding that this is also a technology that I think is probably more important than we yet know.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's ways in which it can be used that are still continuing to evolve. And another point that he mentions is coinage, and how coinage was invented to abstract symbolic thought.
Yeah.
And now you see this whole revolution of cryptocurrencies and ways that money can be transferred or value can be transferred through trust. And it's a whole innovative way that we can make exchange with one another. And the whole idea behind cryptocurrency is that other people are validating the exchange, the community, as opposed to a authority, as in the central banking system. Central banking system was what was creating the value or saying what the value of this bill, what this coin is. There's symbolic understanding of that. And through this crypto exchange, it is your community that is also invested in the same coin, even though this is a completely virtual coin. So maybe that does benefit us. Maybe that is adaptive for symbolic thinking to be virtual.
I think we somehow just to accept the fact that humans a few years from, well, a few hundred years, it's also relative, um, is not going to be in many ways similar than what we are. There's going to be great changes to what humanity is because of all of this. But hey, if it's a society based, if trust is the currency used, then count me in.
Yeah.
Like that
And
is a currency.
community. I mean, it
Yes.
brings back this idea of us being together on something where when I think we first got into the internet, it was like we were saying, where it's this individual. I am here. I am presenting myself. Here's my age, sex, location. Like that was literally like what chat rooms began with. You just always announce, this is me. This is who I am. And now we're kind of moving into this realm of being a community again that's all agreeing on a similar idea of this coin represents this. One of them, Varus coin represents privacy and the ability to take back your identity from online. So that's just one example. Um, but the full idea is, yeah, you trust your community to not go through a scam, because there's a lot of scams in cryptocurrency. So this is another realm that we have to kind of search through the bullshit and find out who's actually trustworthy, and how do you make those connections now that they're no longer, I'm holding out my hand so you can move it up and down to check me for weapons.
I love that scene.
Ooh.
Yes. Which brings us back to the axial age, actually, and the whole taking responsibility.
Yes.
That was the main thing that those religions were all about. We're in great suffering, but we brought it over ourselves.
Yep.
So, as Jordan Peterson says, maybe we should start cleaning our room. And that responsibility called for by the axial age religions, how that is absolutely indispensable also now to us. And because we also talked about the whole responsibility against, um, what do you call it? Uh, Rights.
Right. Right. Those are we, especially in the States, are unalienable rights. The
Yeah.
creator passed those to us. And it's like, who's that creator you're talking about? Because it isn't the divinity above. It was the creation of this country or the creation of whatever entity that guarantees that for us. The society guarantees that. It isn't a guarantee. It isn't actually a right to life. You're you're lucky. You're very fortunate if you get to exist without the fear of a predator attacking, or you not being able to provide food for yourself because now you've used all the resources from your local area and now you've got to venture out even further. Yeah.
And give due where it has to be given. Humanity created those rights for us.
Hmm.
You were talking about tradition and culture earlier, like how important, and how that's been like, oh no, it's all bad and we should throw down the patriarchy or whatever else there is that's bad. um I'm not saying we should bring anything back, but
Right.
but
There are
but
certain things that we are standing on the shoulders of giants.
yes, yes, we feel like we have all these rights, but we didn't. Our forefathers uh, fought for these privileges which we have. And yeah, it's time to maybe start taking up the responsibility for fighting for privileges again, instead of for crying for our rights. That's
Hmm.
mm,
Yeah, yeah. And so the way that we got here was that, symbolic thinking, so shamans and metaphors, and then we go to symbolic thinking of writing that down in hieroglyphs and cuneiform. Then we move into literacy and that being more available for people through the alphabetic symbols. So now there's more literate people. And so then there comes this understanding, this people seeing how much they can correct their cognition because now they've been writing it down. So they're going to go back and review it, reflect on it, and change it, like we were talking about with us in my journaling and in these videos, us watching our videos. And, then going to gather more information and realizing, oh, maybe I was wrong about that. And so there has to be this incentive or this desire to make corrections on yourself through that cognition and that self transcendence. It's no longer just about me because we as humans have caused these trials and tribulations. So maybe if we clean up our act, we can flip things around. And so while they were correcting their cognition, they were also enhancing their awareness of the self and how deceptive they can be to themselves and how much error there is in their cognition. So this is what we're saying about taking up responsibility is it's all about awareness of how we deceive ourselves into thinking that what we want is actually good for us in some cases.
mm. And, so as I mentioned, I don't have Flow with me, but I have two other books of Csikszentmihalyi with me, which I read like in 2015, I think. If I look at the comments, I wrote about a certain man, and so
It tracks.
it tracks. It's one way to keep track of time, right?
Right.
And indeed, he writes. There's so much in what you said that, um, taking responsibility for our further evolution. Like, who do we want to be?
Yeah. I mean, it applies to astrology in this way that you embody the archetypes. Who do you want to be? Well, today I want to be Vesta. And I'm going to embody that archetype and take on what Vesta holds true to herself, which is being the keeper of the hearth and providing that light for other people. And when I subscribe to those ideals, then I'm embodying that higher entity of myself. I'm no longer somebody that wants chocolate every minute and, a soda on the side, or whatever it is. Like we can get, these addictions, he says, are actually a kind of like a manipulation of something that is very adaptive in the beginning.
Mm.
So that kind of lines us up here for, when we fall victim to our addiction because we're not self-aware, we're not outside the self, calling ourselves out like, hey, you said you weren't going to do that, or you said you were going to do this, you were going to work out today. Where's that? Why are you not doing what you said you were going to do? And if there's a valid reason, of course you're not going to like push your body beyond what you should, but there's still some recognition and the responsibility of, if my diet goes off the rails and then I'm no longer healthy, that's something that I did. And I need to be self aware enough to recognize that and not think that, well, if they had told me, that my food was should have been better, or if the pyramid was delivered in a different way where bread wasn't the most important thing, then I wouldn't have. But no, it's like, no, you actually have to be self aware enough to say, maybe I don't feel good when I eat a lot of bread, whatever the case may be.
Growing up as a species, we need to grow up and take responsibility for. Um, I often point out to people like how it's easy to blame our parents because everybody's parents fucked up.
Yep.
But at a certain point, you just have to unfuck yourself now. Now you're a grown up.
Mm-hmm.
You're your own responsibility now, and we need to grow up as a species as well. Like, which is, it seems to me at least, what the people did in the axial age. And
Yeah, because you were talking about how this required a lot of suffering. And when you do your work, when you actually go back through your childhood and the effects that that had on you, and you actually put yourself through that, not damning everybody else and saying it's their fault, their fault, their fault. Let me do the inner work. Once you do the inner work, it's hard. You're lonely. Nobody else is with you. And you're crying, you're punching pillows. Like, if you're actually doing the work, it is like war, it is like chaos. And then you start to realize, just like they did in the axial age, and start to take responsibility for any time that you go off the rails, or when things upset you, like, why is that happening right now? It's no longer about this conditioning that I had, because I've reckoned with that. And even if it still pops up and bubbles up every now and then, you at least have the self-awareness of, this is a pattern that keeps happening. Why does this pattern keep happening? Well, because I'm not taking responsibility and being the creator in my own life, and fixing those things by taking responsibility and being disciplined.
I think what is important is a why. And spoiler alert, one one of the one of the important things of finding life meaningful is being connected to something bigger than you.
Mm,
And if you manage to take care of yourself because you know that is important for the whole, then it's going to be, I'm not saying easier because it's not easy. We're programmed indeed to eat, consume all the sugar we can, and things like that. But at least then there's a why. And who's that guy? The one. Oh, um, but I think he quoted Nietzsche when he said, "If there's a why, any what can be bearable," or something like that.
mm.
But I want to read that quote that Buddhistic quote, which I think is, if we're going to do this for the good of the greater whole, then this is important way. And also because you talk about embodying the different goddesses, and why we do that. Act always as if the future of the universe depended on what you did, while laughing at yourself for thinking that whatever you do makes any difference.
Love
That
it.
is the golden mean between taking yourself seriously and not taking yourself seriously enough.
It was just so great to use serious play as a descriptor of this. It's
Yes.
serious, but it's play.
Yes, I love that. I
Hmm.
love that.
Yeah, and I was talking to you about because we were trying to solve the consciousness problem. What is consciousness? But I thought it was really interesting that we got to this place of like consciousness steers us. Being aware of things allows us to take the steering wheel and at least kind of, again, play, but, play in this way where we're, pushing ourselves to overcome the things that take us. In astrology, it's the first house is the helm of the ship in ancient astrology. It's your personality, and it's how it's the character that's trying to um, obtain this ideal of the sun. So your sun sign, that everybody's familiar with their sun sign, well, your sun sign is actually that ideal to which you strive, but it isn't how you do it. So the helm of the ship is the character, and it's going to describe how we navigate the physical world in order to achieve this ideal of recognizing full consciousness and our place in the full cosmic joke. It's a joke. That's the best part about it is, you know, um,
But it's
like
a
I said
serious joke.
earlier. What's that?
It's a serious joke.
The serious joke.
Yeah.
Well, because like I said earlier about the gods and our relationship with them is that we're enamored by them. We think, oh, how great it would be to live forever. And this quote, and I don't have it on me, but it's basically something to the effect of, what the gods see in us that they're enamored by is that we do die, and that means that there's meaning because there's an end point. So we have to make, the most out of this short amount of time that we have. And part of that is recognizing that why to create meaning.
Mhm. And this may be a good place to bring up understanding, that understanding the importance of, well, to me at least, of understanding, and how what we are doing is an attempt not only to understand John's work, but as I've said, like, I'm quite sure if I can get a grasp on his work, I can get a grasp on reality, because I see something very real there, very real. And I told you I have a quote from Spinoza
Mhm.
about the importance of understanding. All efforts which we make through reason are nothing but efforts to understand. And the mind, insofar as it uses reason, it judges nothing as profitable to itself, excepting that which conduces to understanding. And that understanding, that brings us back to the whole metaphor, because this is also a physical, exapted from the physical, like to really stand under something, to be with it completely, engulfed in it. So if I can immerse myself, stand under the work of John, I'm quite sure I will be much closer to being emerged with reality.
Mhm.
And that is such a deep need of a human being, I think.
Yep. Yeah, I couldn't help but think behind stand wouldn't be as flowing of a word as a understand, because you can be under, but you can also be behind. And then that way you can get behind the idea. I understand it to the extent that I can get behind that and participate in that. Be behind.
It's also physical.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's
Participate in it, but to
participate.
participate in
Yep.
reality.
And that's what people started to recognize in the axial age is that they could. They now had the ability to reflect on writing. And this just is an exaptation again of taking that ability to see your writing and correct it and now applying that same principle to the physical realm. So, in that way, metaphorically thinking about how I can correct things that I've done, even I can correct my being. I don't just correct the words that I've said, that I've written on paper, that are physical. I'm
Mhm.
exapting this same idea of second order thinking and applying that to my my time here. And there again, like, time was constructed too. So even in that way of understanding time, they get to that second order thinking, and then they can apply that to this chronological story that they've come up with. It's a chronological story that they can correct. I can correct my past now because the past exists. And I have this second order thinking of it.
I think it might also be interesting to mention, because there's a whole debate about free will and how much influence do we have. And in John's talk with Ian McGilchrist, I think they handled that really important, really, really great. Like, we can influence our character, because you also refer to the character being the front of the ship,
Yep.
and what steers us. We can influence our character by doing something really simple: influencing our habits,
Yep.
deciding on our habits and sticking to it. That forms, then I'm kind of quoting Aristotle here, which is, I think, an actual age philosopher. So it fits.
It works.
Um, it works. Um, by by cultivating habits that we choose, because we want to choose who we become, we're cultivating a character that then influence our lives, at least, if not the lives of others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it brings me back to flow too, and just thinking about how we can flow in this way that's like a video game, where it's not actually, well, so all those that play video games, I'm not dissing you, but it's not as productive as getting in a flow state that's about my discipline and my character. Not my character in the game, but my character in real life, in this not dress rehearsal. You're living life. You
In
have
this
a
game,
certain amount of time.
in this huge game of life.
Yes. So it's fun, and it's something we can be playful with, and seriously playful, because the consequences of not are detrimental. You can clearly put yourself into patterns of thought that aren't healthy for you. So it's really important to understand and reflect and correct the patterns that you are and that you participate in. Oh, I like this pattern that we have of meeting and discussing, because
I
it definitely
love it.
puts it into a better perspective. John's got a beautiful way of talking, but hearing people converse about it, there's a third entity that gets created there where somebody can relate now to what we're saying. And so my astrology partner and I experience this, where we kind of create that third entity. And so your wisdom of discovering where John is pulling the information that he gets, and kind of my playing the fool, which we're both playing the fool. You wanted to iterate that you're the, learned fool and continuing to learn. And if we
Oof.
can stay in the full mentality, and continue to accept that the only thing that we can know is that we know nothing, then it allows us to play with all of these ideas. But really, you always want to be the evolving fool. You always want to be taking the lessons and incorporating them in. And I like to talk about the fact that the fool is oftentimes the first and the 22nd card, or the first and the last card. So the fool reemerges, but it's an advanced fool. It's now ready to take on a whole new set of perhaps suffering, because that's what they went through in the lead up to the axial age. There was a lot of suffering that was involved. So you can have control over the amount of suffering that you experience by being disciplined and by understanding yourself and making those corrections.
Self transcendence come to mind. And in the spirit of playing and the world being a game, um, and the fool, I do want to quote Shakespeare again. All the world is a stage, every man and woman merely a player. Let me play the fool.
Let me play the fool. I love it.
Amen.
I think that's a beautiful way to end it. So, we hope that you enjoyed this discussion that we have. We hope that you'll continue to play the Fool as well and keep coming back to watch our episodes. And then, of course, watching John's episodes of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series so that you can get your own interpretation and maybe even revisit multiple times all of this and join in the discussion in the comments. We'd love to hear if you have anything you want to add to what we've discussed here. And with that being said, we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.